As the minister of faith formation, I work in particular with our youth and young adults. So our youth are always at the front of my mind. And I think about, do you have any advice for your younger self when you were a teenager that you wish you had known or someone had told you when you were younger, looking back as looking at your sexuality and gender identity?
Yeah. I think the thing that was the most confusing to me growing up in a church that talked, maybe this won't be as relevant to the folks here at this particular church, but we talked when I grew up a lot about the concept of original sin and needing salvation, right? And like that is a core part of the gospel. But that concept of original sin was so hammered in, that idea of like there is something intrinsically wrong with you that you need help with, that I connected that to my sense of feeling different. I connected that to my sense of feeling different, whether it was around sexuality or gender or whatever. I thought that was why I felt so weird. I thought that was why I felt different from everybody else. I spent most of my life thinking everybody felt as bad about their gender as I did, because I just thought maybe this is normal for people. Maybe this is just what sin feels like. And so I wish I would have had teachers and people in my community to really affirm that, like, you can feel different, you can feel weird, you can feel kind of like an outsider, but that is not your sinful identity. That's not what we're talking about here. And I wish that would have been brought home a little bit more for me as a kid.
Thank you. We have a question here that's asked, what is your favorite thing about being trans?
I love that question because I think we tend to think about like all the terrible things that kind of come with being trans sometimes. And those are real. And, for me, as somebody who can walk down the street and most people look at me and just see a white guy and they don't know that I'm trans, they don't know that I'm bisexual, I am at a lot less risk than most of my trans siblings. So there are bad things that happen to trans folks, specifically trans folks of color. But I think we could do more to celebrate the wonderful things. And so for me, one of the wonderful things about being trans is more of a sense of freedom around what I am allowed to do as a guy, to be more okay with being able to cry and express emotion and not have that threaten my sense of like gender. We're so bad with teaching young boys specifically that they have to really clamp down on emotion. And so I think being trans allows you a little bit more space to kind of be like, you know what, my gender, like some of it is very much inherent, but some of it is what I make it. And so that allows for a little bit more breathing room, I think.
Thank you. Another question. Austen, an extraordinary exposition and illumination of the text. Will you please comment on the Pauline texts that are used against LGBTQ people?
Ooh, that's a big one. So there aren't as many Pauline texts that are used around gender. Paul doesn't tend to talk, well, there's like one. Paul talks in, I can't remember if it's 1st or 2nd Timothy, but he talks about how it's unnatural for men to have long hair. And the thing that's important to remember about that text is that unnatural in the ancient Greek world didn't mean doesn't appear in nature. That's usually how we think of it, like, well, it doesn't appear in any other animal species, so it's unnatural, right? That's not what Paul means. Unnatural in the Pauline world, the ancient Greek world, meant not a social norm. It is not natural in our society to have long hair for men, right? So Paul's not making a moral judgment there. He's making a sort of a cultural judgment. Other than the long hair thing, Paul doesn't really talk too much about gender expectations. He does talk a lot more about sexuality. And so those are texts that people do have to wrestle with when we think about sexuality. And it's way too long to go into here. But I would suggest, if you want to check out God and the Gay Christian by Matthew Vines, that's like a wonderful basic text, really easy to read, that does look at all of those Pauline texts and more when we talk about sexuality.
Thank you. We have a lot of great questions here, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. Have you been personally talking with Jewish scholars? I like that question.
Yeah, luckily, my girlfriend is Jewish, so that works out well. I get to sort of tag along to some of her community things. But yes, I've actually found that Jewish communities are much further along in LGBT acceptance and inclusion than Christian communities tend to be. Not always. Some Orthodox communities are still kind of struggling with what this means for them. But in general, it's been incredibly helpful to be in Jewish communities who read the text that we think of as the Old Testament, because for them it's not like old passed away stuff, right? This is stuff that is still relevant to the way they live their lives. And so for me, it's really enriched my sense of the life of the text to be able to read with Jewish folks.
Another question, what does, here we are in Pride Month. It says, what does pride mean to you? And the second part of the question is, what differences does religious involvement in LGBTQ plus communities mean to you during this, especially, I think, during Pride?
Yes, so I want to answer that second question first. A lot of the work that I'm doing right now is specifically around research in affirming church communities and what that looks like and how it works and what it means. There is a direct link. We know that LGBT youth have the best mental health outcomes, social outcomes, physical health outcomes when they are surrounded by supportive family, even if they just have one supportive family member, right? We know that that's true. They do best when they have supportive family. We know that families tend to become affirming and supportive when they are involved in a affirming, supportive faith community. And so we've got the faith community supporting the parents, which then supports the kids. Because we know that 41% of transgender people attempt suicide, like compiled for people of color, for trans people of color, up to almost 75 or 80% attempting suicide. This is a public health risk, to be honest, for transgender youth specifically. And so for me, cultivating pride means cultivating a fully affirming community that can support affirming families, that can support youth, that can have that sense of pride in their identity. Again, not in a way that is sort of overbearing or, better than any other identity, but a sense of being beloved and wonderfully made. To me, pride is about remembering that you are beloved and wonderfully made.
Amen, amen. This question is related along the lines of family, and it's asking about you and how did your church family react when you came out? Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, so while I was in seminary, I got connected with a church in St. Paul, where I live now, a really pretty small church plant called Humble Walk. There's probably only about 100 people in it. And when I started going there, they just knew me as like a seminary student. I wasn't out as trans yet. They knew I was bisexual, and that was fine with them. They're an affirming community. But after graduating from seminary, I kept going, and throughout my transition, I kept going. And we have this wonderful practice. Because it's a small church, we can kind of spend time talking to each other in a way that's hard to do at larger churches. But every Sunday, we have this little bucket of like tiny pebbles, and at the end of every church service, we have people, anybody who wants to, who has like something they want to share about their life, they all line up, and everybody takes a pebble, and they say like, this is my thing that happened to me this week that I would like to share with the community, and then they drop it in this other bucket, and they say milestone, and everybody responds milestone. And it can be a big thing, like getting a new job. It can be something like losing a tooth. The little kids love to run up and be like, I had a party at my friend's house, and we're all like, milestone. It's wonderful. But when I started transitioning, when I started my medical transition, I would go up every couple of weeks and be like, this is my 4th month on testosterone. And I'd put my thing in, and everybody would go, milestone. And it was just like this incredibly affirming thing for me. And something to just like, to be able to share with your community and have them respond in such a wonderful, loving way was a really, really cool experience.
Awesome. Next question is another one related to different religions. How is trans treated in Islam? If you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I have only sort of marginally done work with Muslim communities. There aren't nearly as many written resources right now for Muslim folks as there are for Jewish and Christian folks. And that's saying something, because there aren't a lot for us either. But there are a couple of inclusive mosques. The most well-known one is Masjid al-Rabia, that's in Chicago. They are the first women-started trans-inclusive mosque in the country. There's also another one in San Francisco. I don't know if there's one in New York. I think those are the only two that I know of right now. So the movement is happening in very similar ways. They are also struggling with their texts and what those texts mean for them. But it's a movement that's happening there in similar ways, and in ways where we can kind of come alongside each other, I think.
Thank you. Couple more questions. This one's about societal norms, and just asking if you could speak from your experience how you've seen societal norms change, identifying as transgender, and asking if you have a hope for there will be a day without societal norms where we can just be who we are and not have to, how we've seen society change where, coming out isn't as big of a deal as it used to be for my parents' generation, but for me it was a huge thing, and our youth, it's still a big thing, but maybe one day it isn't. But just like you were saying in your presentation, having that courage to still say, this is who I am. What have you done work and heard people talk about the changes they've seen?
Yeah, I think the main one of the questions I get a lot of the time is, why are there so many more trans people now? Is it in the water? What's going on? The main difference is that we are hearing parents are listening to their kids in a way that they haven't done before. There is a huge social shift that's happening where 50 years ago, if your 6-year-old boy, you think, comes to you and says, Mom, I am a girl. I know I'm a girl. I would really like to wear this dress for Halloween or for Easter or whatever. 50 years ago, we kind of said, please don't tell anybody about that. Don't let the neighbors know. Let's hide that. Today, if your kid comes to you and says that, parents suddenly go, oh, I think I saw something about that on the news maybe. Maybe we should find somebody who knows more about this. Parents are much more willing to kind of go, this is something we should dig into. With kids, we say, sort of in the childhood development and mental health field, we say if kids are insistent, persistent, and consistent about their gender, that means that something probably really is up, right? And so that's the biggest movement I've seen, is parents paying attention to that in their kids and going maybe this is something that we need to think about, or this is something that we need to find help with. There's also been a few studies that have happened in the past about 3 to 5 years that have shown that more and more young people are identifying as genderqueer or gender fluid, something that is a little bit more open to different understandings of gender. And I think that's really cool. I think that's something that can teach everybody something about their gender and about how we should treat other people and respect other people's identities. So yeah, I think there's good movement at the same time as really bad stuff is happening, right? So we're holding these things in tension. Not to get too theological on you here, but there's this theological concept coined by a German guy a long time ago. He said, as Christians, we live in the already and the not yet at the same time. The kingdom of God is already here and it is not yet here. Those are both true things. And I think trans folks experience that every day. We are already living it here, and yet we are not quite where we need to be. So I think living in that tension is a place that inspires growth.
Thank you. We had a question about you and your story, that your story is so powerful, and the power of storytelling. And the wonderful book that you wrote, can you talk about how you decided to write a book and devote your life going around to sharing this story and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, for me it was essentially every time I would talk about it started out in seminary where I was doing research. That Isaiah 56 text I shared, that was my senior thesis, was learning about that text. And the more I talked about it and the more I shared my story, the more people were like, great, where else can we read more about this? And I was like, we don't really have any books. So really, writing this book just came out of a need because there are a couple of books written by trans theologians that are very good, but very academic and kind of hard to read. And then there was one, like the one book we did have that was more accessible, went out of print, and you couldn't get one for less than $100. And so it was kind of like, we need a new resource. And so for me, writing Transforming was about marrying the biblical text study to the actual stories of people who are trans today and what they're going through in the church, and making that real for folks. And because I think, like you said, stories are powerful. Narrative is one of the most powerful things for us. And so sharing those stories and helping, being able to use like any platform that I have to like lift up other people so that share their stories is really, really important to me.
Thank you. Friends, we have a couple more minutes left. If anyone would like to ask a question live, Ruben has the microphone in the back. If you want to raise your hand and we'll come to you. We can take a couple questions.
Hello, thank you very much. Can you repeat the quote about the stained glass window?
Oh, well, what did I say? I said, well, just that when we talk about Christian community, that we're called to oneness and not sameness. And that, to me, looks like the difference between a wall painted all the same color, that we're not called to be a wall painted all the same color, but we are called to be much more like a stained glass window, in that we all bring our own colors and our shapes, and then together we can make a larger picture. Yeah.
I'm aware that growing up, I've always been taught that God is all-encompassing. And so the moment you say God, he, you limit God. If you say she, you limit God. So I've learned to refer to God as God. And so if God is all-encompassing, how is God not a direct example of what it means to be inclusive?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think one of the things that I talk about in terms of like how churches can actively become more affirming is by thinking very closely about their language, about like what pronouns do we use for God. And I love that there was a mix of different pronouns going on in church this morning, right? It's great. It's awesome. When we think about the pronouns that we use for God, there was this feminist theorist who I have a lot of problems with, but she did say something really great, which is when we think of God as masculine, we start to think of the masculine as God, right? And so this sense of like recognizing the diversity within the being of God can help us recognize the diversity in human beings. Comes from that same thing of human beings being created in the image of God, which means God then does include all of those different kinds of gender, right? Recognizing that in our worship services is incredibly important.